My Ántonia by Willa Cather. Chapter 3. On Sunday morning, Otto Funks was to drive us over to make acquaintance of our new Bohemian neighbors. We were taking some provisions, as they had come to live on a wild place where there was no garden or chicken house, and a very little broken land. Funks brought up a sack of potatoes and piece of cured pork from the cellar, and grandmother packed some loaves of Saturday's bread, a jar of butter, and several pumpkin pies in the straw of the wagon box. We clambered up to the front seat and jolted off past the little pond and along the road that climbed up the big cornfield. I could hardly wait to see what lay beyond that cornfield, but there was only red grass like ours, and nothing else, although from the high wagon seat one could look off a long way. The road ran along like a wild thing, avoiding the deep draws, crossing them where they were wide and shallow, and all along it, wherever it looped or ran, the sunflowers grew. Some of them were as big as little trees, with great rough leaves and many branches, which bore dozens of blossoms. They made a gold ribbon across the prairie. Occasionally, one of the horses would tear off his teeth a little plant of blossom, full of blossom, and walk along munching it, the flowers nodding in time to his bites as he ate down towards them. The Bohemian family, grandmother told me as we drove along, had bought the homestead of a fellow countryman, Peter Krunks, and had paid him more than it was worth. Their agreement with him was made before they left the old country through a cousin of his, who was also a relative of Miss Sherber's. The Sherdas were the first Bohemian family to come to this part of the country. Kershke was their only interpreter and could tell them anything he chose. He could not speak enough English to ask for advice or even to make their most pressing wants known. One son, Funks said, was well grown and strong enough to work the land. The father was old and frail and knew nothing about farming. He was a weaver by trade. He had a trades workman on tapestries and upholster material. He had brought this fiddle with him, which wouldn't be of much use here, though he used to pick up money by it at home. If they're nice people, I think of them spending the winter in the caves of Krunks, said grandmother, is no better than a badger hole. No proper dugout at all. And I heard he's making them pay $20 for his old cook stove that ain't worth 10. Yeah, ma'am, said Otto. And he sold him oxen and his 2 bony old horses for the price of good team worksmen. I've interfered with about the horses, and the old man could understand some German if I'd thought if it would do any good, but Bohemians has a natural distrust of Australians. Grandmother looked interested. Why is it that, Otto? Funks wrinkled his nose and brows. Oh, ma'am, it's politics. It would take me a long while to explain. Land was growing rougher. I was told that we were approaching the Swan Creek, which cut up the west half of the Sherdad's place and made the land of little value for farming. Soon we can see the broken, grassy clay cliffs, which indicate the windings of the stream, and the glistening tops of the wooden cots, the cottonwoods, and the ash trees that grew down in the raves. Some of the cottonwoods had already turned, and the yellow leaves and shining white bark made them look like gold and silver trees in fairy tales. As we approached the Sherdad's dwelling, I could see nothing but rough red hillocks and draw with shelves banks and long roots hanging out where the earth had crumbled away. Presently, about one of those banks, I saw a sort of shed. tethered by the same wine-colored grass that grew everywhere. Near it tilted a shuttered windmill frame that had no wheel. We drove up to the skeleton to tie our horse, and when I saw a door, the window skunked behind the drawbank. The door stood open, and a woman and a girl of 14 ran out and looked at us hopefully. A little girl trailed behind them. The woman had on her head the same embroidered shawl with silk fringe that she wore when she was alighting from the train at Blackhawk. She was not old, but she was certainly not young. Her face was alert and lively, with sharp chin and shrewd little eyes. She shook grandmother's hand energetically. Very glad, she ejaculated. Immediately she pointed at the bank out of which she had emerged and said, House no good. Grandmother nodded contagiously. We'll get this up comfortably after a while, Miss Sheridan. Make good, house. My grandmother spoke in a very loud tone to foreigners as if she were deaf. She made understand the friendly intentions of our visit, and the Bohemian woman handled loaves of bread and even smelled them and exclaimed the pies with lively curiosity, explaining, Very good, much thank you. And after she wrung grandmother's hand, the oldest son, Arbros, which they called him Ambroch, came out of the cave and stood beside his mother. He was 19 years old, short and broad-backed, with a close-chopped, flat head and a wide, flat face. His hazel eyes were little and shrewd like his mother's, but more sly and conspicuous. They fairly snapped at the food. The family had been living on corn banks and sorghum molasses for 3 days. The little girl was pretty, but Ántonia, they accented the name thus strongly when they spoke to her, but the little was still prettier. I remember what the conductor had said about her eyes. They were big and warm and full of light, like the sun shone on brown pools in the woods. Her skin was brown too, and her cheeks she had a glow of rich, dark color. Her brown hair was curly and wild-looking. The little sister, whom they called Joka, was fair and seemed mild and obedient. While I stuck awkwardly confronting the two girls, Karski came up from the barn to see what was going on. With him was another shearbird's son. Even from a distance, one could see that there was something strange about this boy. As he approached us, he began to make unconscious noise and held up his hands to show us his fingers, which were webbed at the first knuckle, like a duck's foot. When he saw me draw back, he began to crow delightedly, Hoo! 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 Like a rooster. His mother scowled and said sternly, Marke! Then spoke rapidly to Karski in Bohemian. She wants me to tell you that won't hurt nobody, Miss Burden. He was born like that. The others were smart. Ambrosch, he made good farmer. He struck Ambrosch on the back. The boy smiled knowingly. At that motion, the father came out of the hole in the bank. He wore no hat, and his thick iron gray hair was brushed straight back from his forehead. It was so long it brushed out behind his ears and made him look like the old portrait I remembered in Virginia. He was tall and slender, and his thin shoulders stooped. He looked at us understandingly, then took grandmother's hand and bent over it. I noticed how white and well-shaped his own hands were. They looked calm somehow, and skilled. His eyes were melancholy, and set back deep under his brows. His face was ruggedly formed, but it looked like ashes, like something from which all the warmth and light had died out. Everything about this old man was in keeping with his dignified manners. He was neatly dressed. Under his coat he wore a knitted gray vest, and instead of a collar, a silk scarf of a dark bronze green, carefully crossed and held together by a red coral pin, which Karski translated for Mr. Sherda. Ántonia came up to me and held out her hand coaxingly. In a moment we were running up the steep draw aside together. Janka trotting after us. When we reached the level, we could see the gold treetops. I pointed towards them, and Ántonia laughed and squeezed my hand as if to tell me how glad she were I'd come. We raced towards Squad Creek and did not stop until the ground itself fell away before me so abruptly that the next step would have been out in the treetops. We stood panting on the edge of the ravine, looking down at the trees, the bushes that grew below us. The wind was so strong I had to hold my hat on, and the girls' skirts were blowing out before them. Ántonia seemed to like it. She held her little sister by the hand and chattered away in the language, which seemed to me spoken so much more rapidly than mine. She looked at me, her eyes fairly blazing with things she could not say. "Name! What name?" she said, touching me on the shoulder. I told her my name, and she repeated it after me and made Joka say it. She pointed into the gold cottonwood tree behind whose top we stood and said again, "What name?" She sat down and made a nest in the long red grass. Joka curled up like a baby rabbit and played with grasshoppers. Ántonia pointed up to the sky and questioned me with her glance. I gave her the word, but she was not satisfied and pointed to my eyes. I told her, and she repeated the word, making it sound like ice. She pointed up to the sky, then to my eyes, then back at the sky with movements so quick and impulsive that she distracted me. I had no idea what she wanted. She got up on her knees and wrung her hands. She pointed to her own eyes and shook her head, then to mine and to the sky, nodding violently. "Oh!" I exclaimed. "Blue! Blue sky!" She clapped her hands and murmured, "Blue sky, blue eyes," as if to amuse herself. While we snuggled down there out of the wind, she learned a score of words. She was quick and very eager. We were so deep in the grass we could see nothing but the blue sky over us and the gold trees in front of us. It was wonderfully pleasant. After Ántonia said new words over and over, she wanted to give a little chest silver ring she wore on her middle finger. When she coaxed and insisted, I repulsed her quite sternly. I didn't want her ring. I felt that there was something reckless and extravagant about her wishing to give it away to a boy she had never seen before. No wonder Cox got the better of these people. If this is how they behaved, while we were disputing about the ring, I heard a mournful voice calling, "Ántonia! Ántonia!" She sprung up like a hare. "Tanik! Tanik!" she shouted, and we ran to meet the old man who was coming towards us. Ántonia reached him first, took his hand and kissed it. When I came up, he touched my shoulder and looked searchingly down into my face for several seconds. I became somewhat embarrassed, for I used to be taken for granted by my elders. We went with Mr. Sherda back to the dugout, where grandmother was waiting for me. Before I got into the wagon, he took a book out of his pocket, opened it, and showed me a page with 2 alphabets, one English and the other Bohemian. He placed his book in my grandmother's hand, looked at her entreatingly, and said with earnest, which I shall never forget, "Titish! Titish, my Ántonia!" That was the end of chapter 3 of My Ántonia. Please like, subscribe, comment, and view my channel for more content like this. For the following chapter, it will be posted tomorrow. For the PDF of this book for free, please check the description box below. I hope you enjoyed the reading.